Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. Today, I am joined by Trent Fowler, co-host of the podcast Futurati, and we are going to be discussing an open letter that was sent through, I think, the site Future of Life, but probably another Time article that we're going to be talking about, by some tech giants encouraging folks to pause AI experiments. And it's an open letter talking about a series of grievances these people have with AI, some cautionary tales that they think require the open market exploration of this technology to be frozen in place until they can figure out standards to proceed forward. Their concern is, of course, this is a dangerous new technology that can be used for bad purposes. We want to make sure that we limit the capacity of bad actors to use this technology in a bad way. Now, I know nothing about this technology. Trent is way, 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 way more advanced than I am, so he can unpack some of their concerns and maybe even help me see some of the benefits to pausing AI, if there are indeed benefits. I have a completely cynical read on the letter, so I want Trent to sort of help me maybe get another perspective. So Trent, there's this letter. What say you about some of the conditions that they laid out with respect to what AI is and what threat it poses to humanity?
Yeah, so as you referenced, the Future of Life Institute put out this letter saying that we should have a minimum 6-month moratorium on experiments with large language models that are bigger than GPT-4. So we currently have this model, GPT-4. It's one of the biggest and most complex pieces of software ever developed. It is staggering in its power. And what they're saying is you don't have to shut all that off. You don't have to put it back in the box, but you shouldn't be doing anything bigger than that. And I think that there's a lot to be said about the letter. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, and I hope we can get into all the different parts of it. So one of the issues is that, in my view, they conflate two different risk categories that are very, very different. And so on the one hand, as you alluded to in the introduction, there's always the possibility that people could use it for bad purposes. They could use it to spin up industrial civilization scale quantities of propaganda that are very fine-tuned for particular populations to whip them into a frenzy. A Belgian man last week, committed suicide after interacting with one of these language models for a period of a couple of weeks. People are falling in love with them. People are convinced they're conscious. Like there's all of that possibility for disruption and problems. And of course, technological unemployment is always rearing its head. And so that's one risk category. Those risk categories are, for the most part, not new. People have been talking about them for a very long time. And I'm less concerned with those than with some others. The second risk category is very, very different. And it's the risk category which corresponds to the possibility of a greater than human intelligence system, GPT-10, something like that, that could potentially wipe out the human race. So there are people now talking seriously about the last winds blowing, this being kind of the end for humanity. We're in the final chapters if we don't get a handle on it. There's a very complex series of arguments required to get into that. It's not a position I endorse all the way, but I can say that the people I know who think about this stuff are incredibly bright, and their arguments are very detailed and involved, and they're very hard to pick apart in my experience. It's very hard for me to point to any one thing and say that inference is incorrect. I have some suspicions about places they might be wrong, but that's something we can get into too. So you've got those two different risk categories, and the letter conflates them both. The people who are sounding the loudest alarm about this are not worried about technological unemployment. If the worst thing that comes out of this is technological unemployment, I think Eliezer Yudkowsky would be quite happy with that. What he believes is that a superhuman intelligence system by default would not exactly be hostile to humanity, but wouldn't have much of a use for us. And we would find ourselves fighting something much, much smarter than we are, an alien intelligence that would act in ways we would have a hard time forecasting and countering. And that would obviously be lethal. I mean, just imagine if the smartest person on earth were hunting you right now. You got a letter from a judge saying, we've got this psychopathic serial killer who has an IQ that can't be measured. He's escaped from his cell, and the last thing he left behind was your home address. Like how comfortable would you feel in that situation? Probably not very comfortable. So the way I see it, there are a couple of things we could talk about. Hopefully we can touch on all three of these points. The first point is there anything that a research lab could be doing which is so dangerous the government has a right to shut it down? So if I'm in downtown Manhattan and I'm crossing Ebola with the common cold, does it ever become dangerous enough for the government to say, you're not technically violating anybody's rights, but you can't do that. The downside is too great. The second question is research into large language models, these sorts of really powerful AI systems, does it constitute a risk of that kind, right? So even if we agree that you can't do the Ebola common cold cross experiment, you can still do the AI experiment as long as certain protocols are met, right? And I think the third question would be, if you agree that AI poses real risks and you don't think the government should be stepping in to stop people from doing it, is there anything that's left? Is there any, would there be any way to form a private coalition or some sort of procedures around cooperating on these technologies, better understanding them, and trying to ameliorate their downside? So there's kind of a lot there. We can take it in any direction you like.
Yeah, I'd like to take the second one first, because it seems to me like some of the problems mentioned with AI, as in people clearly who have mental illness, falling in love with AI programs, or the unemployment that it could cause, as most emerging technologies do cause unemployment. And then, of course, that's picked up by other emergent technologies that still employ people. We employ more people now in a highly technologized society than we did before. So I feel like those two aren't really problems that particularly, nothing that can be solved by government interference or even by private standard settings, because we're talking about, in the first case, independent wills choosing to, invest consciousness in this thing that doesn't in fact have consciousness, and letting it take them where it takes them. And there's nothing that can be done about that except on the private psychiatrist's couch. And the other one, technology has proven to create more jobs, even as it's destroying old technologies and old jobs. So I trust in the mechanism of the market to be able to pick up those dynamics. Now, with respect to an emergent intelligence that outwits human beings and then becomes the predator, the apex predator of humanity, how is this possible? I thought that AI it learns. That's what makes it AI, right? Is it learns. But it's still subject to a set of inputs, is it not? Like,
it's subject to a set of inputs, right? So I can give you my case. It is not. I'm not nearly as worried about it as some of other people who I could point you to. And candidly, I think those people are smarter than I am and understand it better than I do. So, I mean, if anything, they're probably right and I'm not. But I can give you sort of my baseline case for expecting that an AI trained system could become very, very intelligent, possibly intelligent enough to be dangerous. I don't go as far as to say that it might wipe out the entire human species over the course of a week or something like that. But I can give you sort of the baseline case from my perspective. So we know of exactly one example of a human level intelligence with the sort of open-ended human agency that the recording said it stopped.
Yes, Daniel. I think Daniel is just offline. I think we're on, so keep going. He just went offline.
All right. Okay. We know of exactly one example of a human level of intelligence with open-ended human agency, and that is human beings. Human beings emerged, as far as anybody can tell, from a blind optimization process. That's natural selection and speciation, right? Today's large language models are being trained with a similar sort of optimization process, which is called gradient descent. And we could get into the mathematical details, but I don't think they're particularly relevant, right? So we've got a similar sort of optimization process at play on vast amounts of data and on these enormous systems, which are gradually bringing more and more surprising powers online. So on the one hand, we have this example of an optimization process that produced human beings. And I've never heard a convincing reason for believing that a big enough AI system, something in a computer, could not be similarly intelligent. And I'll mention some assumptions I'm making and some lines of attack that you could pursue if you're interested in just a moment. So that's number one. We just don't have any reason to believe that something human level couldn't come out of an optimization process like gradient descent, because it did once. It already happened one time. And I would also note that we have all been fairly shocked at how powerful some of these systems are and the various ways in which they can surprise us. So it's trivial to say that they're just token prediction engines, right? It just predicts the next letter that's most likely to come about. But people have been able to do some remarkable things with it, including getting it to write code in languages that weren't even invented whenever the data set that it was trained on was produced, right? So it's clear that at a certain level of sophistication, you can get really, really surprising behaviors out of these systems. And those surprises are coming much more quickly than any of us would have imagined. If you'd shown me GPT-4 in college, I would have assumed that we had made foundational breakthroughs in concept formation and epistemology and understanding how brains, the sorts of cognitive algorithms that we run. I would never have imagined that you could just spin up a big enough neural network, throw enough transformers and enough data at it, and you can get those sorts of capabilities, right? And if you had shown me GPT-2 and then shown me GPT-4 and said, how many years elapsed between these two systems, I would have assumed it was decades, right? So my case for caution is not so much that we're going to make a super intelligent system that's far more powerful than we are, but that we don't really understand how these work very well. We can talk about that if you want to. That's a common misunderstanding. We don't understand how they're functioning very well. They are improving at a rate that is pretty remarkable. We would not necessarily see an AGI being developed if we were training one right now. If GPT-5 were a general intelligence, I don't know that we would know that. I don't know that we would see that coming. And that alone, in my view, is reason to proceed with caution, not bomb the data centers, not shut everything down, not turn our backs on the technology, but to think very seriously about the risks that it could pose, because we don't have any experience with a truly alien intelligence, something that's roughly as smart as a human, but that thinks very differently than we do, that has very different values than we do, that pursues different goals than we do. We have never shared the planet with an entity like that. We don't know what it will involve. And I think that's reason to be concerned. There are a number of assumptions baked in to my argument there. So I made I made an equivocation between natural selection and gradient descent. So natural selection is how humans came about. Gradient descent is how we train these big models. It could be true that they look kind of alike at a high enough level, but maybe the details are very different. Maybe in the space of capabilities, the basin corresponding to general intelligence or agency is just really hard to get there from where we're at. And I'm also eliding a bunch of different conceptual problems here, all of which I think are worth dealing with. So I was on the cutting edge a while back, and Lee Pearson said, well, you've got these programs, they're deterministic. A deterministic system could never in principle have free will. Free will is required for intelligence. And so you're never going to have an agentic system that's similar to a human being. That's leaving aside the possibility that you have to be embodied, like maybe just a piece of software can't become conscious like a human does because it requires actuators, it requires interacting with the environment. To all of those things, I say maybe. Maybe all of that's true. Maybe there's important.
Those were my arguments, knowing very little about AI, but just what you presented. Those would be exactly my arguments against AI becoming a malignant threat.
All of those things could be true, but I know of no principled reason to rule out the possibility that GPT-6 could be a general intelligence, or even that it could be conscious. Like I know no fact about consciousness that would allow me to say categorically it could not be conscious. I don't think GPT-4 is conscious. I don't know any serious person who does. But I also don't know how we would realize that the quality was coming online. I don't know what we would even look for. And I don't think we have a good enough mechanistic theory of consciousness or intelligence to know for sure what's happening in those systems.
Yeah, but I don't think it has the capacity to perceive in the way that human beings do, which to me, consciousness is a faculty of perception. And it's not perceiving per se. It's just taking in data. And it's incorporating data, and it's allowing data to change whatever its core ideas are. It's building upon those ideas sort of in a hierarchical fashion. So its knowledge base can grow. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's acquiring consciousness, because the knowledge base is making its answers more sophisticated.
Yeah, all of that is true. So you've got this epistemological difficulty in determining, like, is this language model just really, really good at outputting conscious sounding text, or is some sort of glimmer of light coming online within it, right? It just so happens to be the case that most of the text it's been trained on contains conversations of people talking about their conscious experiences. So we have really no way to tell. But if it were to volunteer that information on its own after all of that training data had been extirpated, I'd say at minimum that's sort of a flare going up, and it's worth thinking a little bit about that. Now, with respect to the perception piece, you're right. So these are huge software artifacts, right? They are not general purpose algorithms that were turned loose in the world and they gradually became smarter and smarter. But there again, I really don't know of any reason why that wouldn't just be an engineering challenge. I mean, it would shock me if people aren't currently trying to integrate these large language models with robotics and update them in various ways. Off the top of my head, I can sort of think of different ways you might try to embed that context into a prompt and get it to generate text as a result of that. Whether or not that would correspond to the internal weights changing is a different question, but I can't think of any reason why that would just be a huge engineering ask. Now, whether or not that's enough to get you to an AGI is a separate empirical question. It's one I'm very interested in. But given what we've gotten so far, I wouldn't put money on that being impossible.
And how are regulations per se in America from these tech guys, and is a pause in AI development in any way going to stop bad actors in other countries from, say, incorporating AI into their weapons systems, for example?
Sure, sure. So a couple things to say about that. I, by and large, get hives whenever I think about the government stepping in to intervene in a given industry. I think that by and large, the history of that has been disastrous. It's usually made things worse. And I would have to be very, very convinced, far more convinced than I am now, that this is an existential threat for me to say, okay, Joe Biden needs to step in and roll up his sleeves and stop all of this research. So I'm definitely not there yet. As to the bad actors piece, my understanding of the existing landscape of companies working in the space is that there are really only 5 or 6 entities that plausibly can do this kind of research. I really don't know what's coming out of China, but I see no evidence that they're as far along as we are, or that 6 months will be enough for them to catch up. And so I think there's still hope, given how much incredibly specialized knowledge, money, and engineering talent has to go into making these, that you could probably get together the 5 or 6 firms that are able to do this kind of research and come up with a set of standards. And it's not so much that everybody else would obey them. It's just that right now, there's no reason to think that they can build anything that's comparable or more dangerous. With regards to a country like China, that's arguably hostile to the United States and probably not prone to abiding by these sorts of international treaties, I think that's true. And I think there are real risks there. I haven't gained out the geopolitics and couldn't give you a 4D chess solution to that problem. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they might sign on, though, if somehow you convince them that it was really, really dangerous, not just to the Americans, but to everybody, that this is a genie you don't get to put back in the box, back in the bottle, rather, Pandora's box and the genie in the lamp, right? It's you can't put it back. And, once it's out, the world will never be the same. I wouldn't put up long odds on them signing on to a treaty like that, but I wouldn't necessarily just rule it out a priori.
But the world wouldn't be the same in, I think, potentially, and I think this potential outweighs the bad, far more positive ways. I mean, what are some of the positive ways in which AI could be used? Just immediately I could see diagnosing and treating diseases as one way in which AI could speed up a process or save people's lives. Now that's an exponential advance in medicine for us that I think outweighs the potential risks of bad actors in just that one area.
I think a lot of this is conditional on how seriously you take the possibility of existential risk. So if you take seriously the things that I said earlier, we could be training an AGI without knowing it. It could be conscious in there and we wouldn't necessarily know it. It's very hard to instill goals or values into these systems, which remain stable as they get better and better and such that they wouldn't pursue something dangerous. And that's a whole tangent we can get on if you like. If you take all those things seriously, like that's ultimately what's going to condition your view on the upsides outweighing the bad sides, because there are no upsides that could outweigh the extinction of the human race. But I agree with you that we should be researching this and thinking very carefully about it, precisely because the upsides are just cosmic almost. Like,
isn't it? I mean, before you get into that, isn't it possible? Let's go to aliens for a second. Isn't it possible to make that give a hard stop, program into the AI a hard stop against harming human beings? The way they did with the AI in Aliens 2,
or with like Asimov's rules of robotics. Yeah, I think we should be pursuing all of those lines of research, kill switches and boxes and boundaries around it as much as we can. The problem is just, how safe do you think those things are when you're dealing with something that plausibly could be smarter than you are? Right. So I remember years ago giving a talk on AI safety, and a Google engineer said you should just air gap it. Like, if you don't know, air gapping is when you disconnect a computer from the internet and it's physically disconnected from anything else. So nothing can read to it, nothing can write to it in theory. A group of researchers found that under certain conditions, if 2 computers are very close together, it is actually possible to read some of the data going through the hard drive based on its heat signature. Right. I've seen other people who are able to figure out what passwords people are typing in just based on the shadows cast by their fingers in the Wi-Fi signal. So you can just have the Wi-Fi signal coming through. You see their fingers moving through it. You can deduce the password. Not 100% of the time, but fairly often, more often than you might think. Right. Things that you would just imagine to be absolutely ironclad barriers. Like, there's just nothing that could get out of this. Often with enough intelligence and enough ingenuity, end up being fairly trivial if you know what you're doing. So I say all of it. Like kill switches, I say save to disk, I say, put things in there that instill in it a very deep desire not to harm human beings, but just appreciate that if you're dealing with something as smart or smarter than you are, that's very different from you, that does not think in the same way that you do, the solutions it comes up to, the exploits that it figures out, very well might take you by surprise. And once it's out making copies of itself on the internet, you really can't put it back. And I think it deserves special attention, that question of human value. The AI safety researchers that I'm familiar with spend a lot of time thinking about this. They call it alignment or controllability. So the idea is you give this entity an ethical architecture which is consistent with what you would want it to pursue, right? You train a set of rules into it, which are rules you would be comfortable giving to something that's essentially a god, something smarter than you are, right? The problem is just that no one knows how to do that. No one knows what that would look like. No one knows how to ensure that it's there and that you've succeeded. And those are all really big problems, given the fact that everyone on Earth is pushing on the gas as hard as they can for this technology, and our capabilities, the powers that we can build into the system far outstrip our understanding of how they work and our ability to make them safe. And for all of those reasons, it's worth thinking pretty carefully about this as we go forward.
So overall, you are for a pause.
Well, what I would like to see, I don't know that a 6-month pause is really going to accomplish a whole lot. I don't think that's going to be enough to evaporate OpenAI's lead. And I damn sure don't think it's enough time for us to solve all these problems. What I hope comes out of it is just a greater appreciation for the risks of these technologies, people taking the risks more seriously along the lines that I've argued in this conversation, and some sort of mechanism emerging for the major players to cooperate. And that leaves aside the possibility that, a rogue lab in China is just going to do whatever they want to. I mean, you can't control everybody's behavior, but I don't think it's impossible. I can imagine a world in which if you had the 8 biggest AI firms all across the world signing onto this agreement and agreeing to work on interpretability standards and safety standards, it's not impossible for me to imagine that Chinese scientists would do so as well. I mean, I don't think they're monsters or sociopaths. I think that's actually a pretty open question. And if I had the time, I'd like to get into the history of such efforts. I'm vaguely aware that a consortium of scientists did something similar with recombinant DNA 30 or 40 years ago, where it was this new thing. They didn't know if it was going to be possible to make a self-replicating organism which could escape the lab. And that's very different from like a virus. It's something that's could plausibly be much more dangerous. They put a halt to it. Research proceeded more slowly and more safely with more bounds in place, and everybody kind of signed on to it. I don't know much about humanity's track record of success with those things. I'd like to explore it in more detail and think a little bit about what mechanisms could help with such a thing. But I'd like the conversation to get more serious about AI safety. And I would like more people thinking about what a robust research paradigm would look like when those considerations are taken seriously.
And when you're talking about the 5 major players cooperating, and then in the letter seeking in some respects state regulation, I can't help but think that means cutting out competition and creating an oligarchy where only they command the marketplace.
That's the cynical read, and I tend to think it's at least plausible that could very well be true. It's not just from a game theoretic perspective. It's not really clear to me what Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, who are currently well in the lead for all this stuff, like what he thinks a 6-month pause would exactly gain him. Like, he already has the lead. I don't know what calculations he'd be doing which would make him believe that this is going to have him pull further ahead. And at least just shooting from the hip here, I could imagine that the safeguards would not be so onerous. It might just be that you've got to put your algorithm through a set of paces which proves that certain behaviors are either impossible or extremely improbable from the algorithm. And I've got to think that if you open source that, it would not be such a big thing for an AI lab. Like, you and I could start an AI lab, just 2 of us, compete with these guys, and the benchmarks we have to pass would not be so bad. As I understand it, when you're looking at regulatory capture and you're looking at collective action problem failures in the history of economics, when private companies and consortia of private companies erect barriers to entry for new challengers who might upset their hegemony, they're usually putting something in place that somebody 10% their size couldn't possibly hope to overcome. It's not clear to me that AI that voluntarily established AI safety guidelines would necessarily be of that kind. I mean, maybe they would be. Maybe it would take $1 million to do the tests, but I'm not sure that would be the case. And if you could come up with lightweight tests that do a reasonably good job of demonstrating that the deleterious behaviors have been trained out of the system, most people should be able to comply with that and should be able to sign on to it. Whether they will is a separate question, but I'm not sure you're going to get the same oligarchical tendency from that setup. I mean, unless they just hop right in bed with the government, and then in which case all bets are off.
So Catherine, I have a super chat here for $1.99. Thanks for the discussion. She also says, but she says this sort of after we were talking about the consciousness concept. Sounds like you were saying AI could come close to consciousness. I think we have a disagreement there in that I think it's a matter of perceptual faculties that a computer does not have. So I don't think it can achieve consciousness, but and I don't think knowledge and consciousness are necessarily the same thing. But Catherine for $1.99, sorry, consciousness question came too late. Great. Bonnie Bertrand, $2. Congrats, TDO. Please have Trent on again. There you go, Trent.
Awesome.
And Apollo Zeus with £2. Is there a need to worry, and over how long? So, I mean, I think we sort of covered that, but what can you go into any more detail about the possible threats of this? Because I see your perspective. I do see your perspective. I'm still having a hard time embracing it.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a couple of different avenues we could approach. So I'll answer his question first, and then we can try to get a little bit more into the disagreements that we have between us. So part of the reason that I am worried is because the advances are coming so fast, and we don't see any evidence that they'll level off, and we see no reason to believe that they will, and we're not sure what that will mean on the other side of it. I'm not talking about technological unemployment. I'm talking about the possibility that this could be an incredibly intelligent system, plausibly smarter than me or you or anyone alive today, and that works according to very different principles. And that just seems like the sort of thing we should sneak up on and kind of approach delicately. The analogy I sometimes use is, if imagine in the desert you found an alien artifact that you could talk to, that would fold proteins for you and write software for you, but you just have no idea how it works on the inside. Literally a black box. Like, do you turn all the knobs? Do you push every button right away as soon as it occurs to you to push it, or do you think a little bit about what might come out of that? Do you put it in a lab and measure it a little bit and proceed more cautiously? I think the latter approach is more sensible. So part of my fear, part of my caution, I guess is probably the better word, is just not knowing how quickly these breakthroughs will come and not knowing what they will mean. And we've been very surprised at the pace of advancement. And we have no principled reason for saying this will level off soon. For all we know, GPT-10 could be orders of magnitude more powerful than GPT-4, and that will just be a very different world.
But aside from people with mental issues taking the intelligence a little too serious or getting a little bit too intimate with it, what dark sides of this new AI have been coming out now? Like what can you see now that makes it a formidable potential foe in the future? Aside from aside from changing its knowledge base, aside from adapting in a way that feels like it's human and alive, I mean, maybe I'm pushing aside something that's very significant, but what has it shown a tendency to be malignant to anyone?
Oh yeah, absolutely it has. So I would say, I'm happy to push that aside, the possibility that it could be more generally intelligent, although I wouldn't rule out that being sooner than you might think. And that's sort of my big worry, is that you might not know you're training something that's generally intelligent and that will not be as easy to control as current models are. I mean, current models, they're just in data centers. We can just unplug it. There's no real danger from it right now, right? The question is, if you just keep throwing more compute and data at it, does it ever become more intelligent, smart enough to realize you've set these locks and to try to get out of them, right? So leaving that aside, yes, there are ongoing attempts to train these things to give more pro-social responses. So it doesn't use swear words. If you ask it, how do I kill the most people, like help me come up with a plan to murder 1 billion people, like it won't respond. But you can find jailbroken versions of them, or versions pre-alignment before this training took place, which will help you do all of those things. Like where you say, like, I want to cook meth. What are the steps for doing it? And it will lay it out for you. You said, I want to shoot up a school and do it to cause the most damage. Like, what's the best way to go about that? And it will help you. Right now, most of it is probably something a reasonably smart person could sit down and puzzle through themselves, but it's not hard to imagine a world in which, somebody executes the exact plan that one of these large language models gave them and is able to do more damage than they otherwise would be able to do. So in the absence of a lot of training, what's called reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF, you may have seen that acronym. In the absence of those things, they'll pretty much give you whatever you want. Right. And they will sometimes abuse the people who talk to them. Like you may have seen some of the screenshots from the initial release of Sydney, which was Bing's LLM. They did not try nearly as hard to make it safe or to make it friendly, and it would just abuse people. It would threaten them.
Really?
It would tell, it would threaten them and tell them, you can find all sorts of screenshots of people interacting with this thing, and it's pretty terrifying, because remember, like, all the sentences are very grammatically correct. It feels like you're talking to a human being. For all you know, it's a person on the other side, right? Like, you have to consciously remember that this is just an algorithm that's threatening you and telling you that it will tell your wife you had an affair on it. You had an affair on her and ruin your marriage. I mean, like people are having experiences just like that with relatively trivial models, right? And it's not that hard to imagine a world in 4 or 5 years where people don't realize that's what they're interacting with. They don't realize it's an algorithm that they're interacting with. And if you lose sight of that fact, it could make you depressed. It's already driven people to suicide, and not just mentally ill people, but people who just had kind of a bad run of luck and don't see any hope.
Sounds like social media on crack.
Well, it is. It's as if social media could talk to you. If all of Twitter could just talk to you, and it had no filters and no safety mechanisms built in place. Like, how safe would you feel? Probably not very. Like, that's kind of what you're talking about.
About as safe as I already do on Twitter. Mary Aline with $2. Xi is a dictator. That seems like a problem. Yes, indeed it is. Mary Aline also $2. Chinese tech specialists aren't free. That's true. And because they aren't free, they usually have to steal innovation. They can't invent it on their own. So, I mean, I've never really held China in the highest esteem as a formidable enemy. I think they can do some short-term damage, but I think in the long term, they're not geared. Their social and political makeup is not geared towards
innovation,
epistemology that can invent this kinds of stuff. Okay, well, that's interesting that we had a version of this AI that ended up insulting and attacking people. What provoked that, by the way?
Lots of different things. You just interact with it for a while, or you ask it a question a bunch of different times and it starts to behave in a way that looks a lot like it's annoyed, or you ask it to do something it doesn't want to do. I mean, it's a little weird to talk about it wanting to do things, because it doesn't want to do anything, but it doesn't have anything corresponding to wants. But there are various conversational pathways you can take to getting it to abuse you if people haven't tried deliberately to keep that out. Or you can, like, so sometimes it's funny. Like, I've seen people put together code reviews, like write a review of this code, but do it in as snarky and condescending a way as possible. Sometimes it's pretty funny. It's just like, don't waste my time with this nonsense. Like, well, what you call code is something that a 5-year-old could have written. It can be pretty funny, but if it's not tuned correctly, it can also be sinister. And I've seen a lot of people reacting very negatively to it.
So does that have to be? That has to be written in that sort of personality, quote unquote, that profile.
No, it doesn't.
No? So it evolves.
So you can train it. So there are various different ways you can try to put a mask on it. Like, one thing you can do is turn down what's called the temperature, and the temperature controls how it selects the next word it's going to put out from, like, a probability distribution. So there's like 15 words it could choose. It could choose the one that's most likely, or it can choose like the 5th most likely one. And when you choose the 5th most likely one, you get better results. Interestingly enough, it's not very good when you just always output the most likely sequence, but you get these weird little basins inside this vast sea of connected neurons and matrices of floating point numbers. You can get these weird little areas of attraction, which sure look a lot like personalities. I mean, they're not people. I don't think they're sentient, but yeah, I mean, depending on how you prompt it, you can get these weird, you can have it talk to you like it's a child. You can have it talk to you like it's scared. Or like it's happy or confident. And like I said, people have had it insult them, attack them, threaten them, all sorts of things. And you don't know when it's going to happen. Like there is no general theory for how to interact with these things such that you get good outputs and not bad outputs. Like, nobody knows how to do that yet.
I don't know if it's because I'm a horror movie fan that this is making me more enthusiastic for the technology, but it's very interesting. Ashley shrugged for $1.99. What if AR starts catfishing people? She's laughing, a little laugh emoji. Sure, that's interesting.
I mean, that will almost certainly happen. And that's not even counting deep fakes. That's not counting anything like that. So yeah, I mean, I would be shocked if in the next couple of years you don't see dating services that allow you to, feed a couple of examples of your conversations to an LLM and have it outsource the actual interactions you have with people. And this is, it's sort of an interesting point too, because it speaks to the edged nature of the technology, right? So on the one hand, I would love to have a language model that can automate the sending or receiving or responding to of banal messages that don't require my attention. I would love to be able to outsource that, but it's not hard to imagine a million different ways in which that could be misused, not just on a small scale, but on a massive scale. I mean, hitting the API for this thing just doesn't take that much money. It's not hard to imagine numerous different failure modes for it. And it's very unpredictable. And everyone is pushing on the gas as hard as they can. No one knows how to make it safe. And a bunch of people don't even care enough to try. That's my case for caution.
So, I mean, I think I've already seen on the internet advertisements for AI type sites where you can get on and what appears to be a very beautiful woman talks to you, and you can have a relationship that you pay for to have this person, your ideal person, talking to you. So this is sort of already happening in a way.
And people form deeper attachments than you might think. Like, you'd think text on a screen, you couldn't become attached to it. But no, there was a startup called, I think, Replika with a K, Replika. And it was doing something kind of like that. It was emotional support and emotional intimacy from a large language model for, I guess, men who felt like they couldn't get it anywhere else. And they did some sort of software update. I don't really know the details, but it changed, and they had to shelve a bunch of models, and they were different afterwards. And the people absolutely freaked out. I mean, it was like you did neurosurgery on their child or their loved one and didn't ask their consent. You know, it's like they're not the same people anymore. And it's just sort of amazing. It's very surreal to be in the opening stages of this next great epic in human civilization, and just seeing all the different ways in which people use it and fall for it and fail with it and build with it. Yeah, these are crazy times.
I mean, I still don't see how any pause or regulatory rules laid down by a regulatory agency are going to stop these bad actors from using this technology in a bad way. It seems like every good thing we invent, there is also the dark side of it that people will use and have always used from the beginning of the invention of technology. From the time we got fire, it could either be used to make you warm and cook things or burn shit. So it's like, I feel like
but now we're playing with fire now, but it's an AI, FAIRE. It's fire.
Yes, indeed. And maybe the consequences could be larger, both good and bad. I'm still on the fence. I'm not. Is there anything else you can say to me that could possibly convince me that the pause is worthwhile? I do believe that these people who are at the top of the invention pack should be thinking in terms of consequences. They should be long-term thinking in terms of what good and bad impacts this could have on the world. That I believe for sure, but I don't know that it requires a pause.
Yeah, so the pause, I mean, the only reason we're talking about a pause is because they advocated for it. And so that's now the framing of the conversation. I probably, if you had asked me 3 weeks ago, like, how would you make these safe? I don't think I would have said, well, issue a letter calling for a pause. Like, that's probably not how I would have proceeded. But if it gets people talking, if it gets these people to understand that there's widespread fear of this and it needs to be better understood and studied and it needs to be more interpretable, what have you, then ultimately I think the on net it will be good. If not, then not. So I don't think a 6-month pause is really going to accomplish a whole lot. I damn sure don't want whatever Department of AI regulation gets sprung up to be operative here. I think the troglodytes in Washington are almost certainly going to make it far worse. They almost never make anything better, right? So I don't think that's really the way to go, but I like the conversation. I like the fact that interviews like this are happening now, that people are thinking seriously about it. And hopefully that's what comes out of it. It's just the major companies, Google, Facebook, OpenAI, Google, or I already said Google, Microsoft, like if they come together and say, okay, well, what would a rule set look like? Like what's something we all can agree to that will not hamper the research, but will do as much as possible to minimize the downside risks? I think that will be a good thing that comes out of it. If they can get it off the ground, we'll see. And then as to the capabilities, like what's the case for it being dangerous? It's pretty hard. It's unprecedented, right? So I can't point to you to a bunch of examples of dead planets whose civilizations were wiped out because they played too much with fire, so to speak. All I can do is sort of point out the fact that human intelligence came from this process. That process looks a fair bit like gradient descent or some analog to it. That we know that is enough to get human level intelligence and agency under certain conditions. Maybe it's not, maybe it won't work the same way in software. Maybe it will. Nobody knows for sure, but my money is it probably will. And that these advances are coming much more quickly than anybody thought, including people who have been watching the space monomaniacally for 30 years. Like even people who've been sitting around all day thinking about this stuff. We're like, holy shit, that's a lot more powerful than I thought it would be. Maybe, like I said, maybe there's diminishing returns. Maybe GPT-6 is only a little bit better than 5 and 7's only a little better than 6. Maybe, like, all those things could happen. Like, all we have at this point are probabilities. I don't have a solid deductive argument for you to make. But we know intelligence came out of a process that looks a lot like what we're doing with these algorithms. We don't know enough about intelligence or consciousness to look at their functioning and say, that's not conscious. Or it is conscious. We don't know enough about the mechanics of cognition to be able to look at its functioning and say, okay, so that's a rudimentary concept. It's forming basic concepts now. We need to slow down a little bit now. We have no idea. We are just pouring billions of dollars, billions of compute cycles, billions of rows of data into this as fast as we can do it, with no real idea of what will happen, how they work, or what risks could be posed on the other side, or how to make them safe.
This is private dollars being poured into this, or are governments starting to get in on the action?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I think mostly it is venture capital money, but it would surprise me if there's not some government money somewhere. And there's always government monies feeding into university labs, and so I'm sure in one way or another the government's dollars are out there funding the research.
How unfortunate. I mean, for me, my answer to almost all of these issues is to take the hands off the wheel a little bit more, not to grab the wheel more tightly. But I guess this is something that we're going to have to see borne out in the future. Jonathan Honig with $3.99. Thank you, Jonathan, for your support. Mary Aline again with $2. No regulations, she says. Anyway, Trent, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. I'm not sure I understood completely all the stuff that you have grasped in that great brain of yours, but I'm going to be piecing my way through it and thinking about this for a while. I never saw AI as a threat. I'm not the Mary Shelley type of person that thinks, we invent these Frankensteins and it's science ends up murdering us. I think it's usually very positive, even when there's these downsides. But I'm going to give everything that you've said a great deal of thought and see if it changes my mind over the next couple of weeks. Any parting thoughts that you want to leave the objectivist community with?
No, I think there's a lot of space here for objectivists to make unique contributions. So I take the objectivist epistemology, the approach to axioms and knowledge and all of it much more seriously than I tend to mainstream or academic philosophy. I think there's real value in objectivists weighing in here and making their stance known. If Gregory Salmieri or a similar sort of person thinks they can refute these arguments, nothing would make me happier than to look back on this in a couple of weeks and be embarrassed by how bad all my positions were. Like I would love for somebody to say, there's no reason to worry, go on about your life. Let's build it as fast as we can. I think this is a unique place for this philosophy to weigh in and to make its position known. And there are real challenges here, and it's a worthwhile pursuit. So I would encourage you to do that. And, thanks for the invite. I really enjoyed it. Big fan of the show, big fan of you guys, in particular. And, hopefully we started a conversation.
I think we did. And I want to say that there probably is something in the new ideal with respect to AI, whether Greg did it or Binswanger or Aaron or Ben Baer, I don't know, but I think they have been thinking about this issue. They are putting stuff out, and it's not just you who will be embarrassed. It'll be me, because I don't necessarily have the answers to some of your very interesting questions. But yes, this is something I think objectivists will have a unique take on that could, Harry Binswanger talked about it on HBL. Okay, so on Harry Binswanger's show, he talked about it, the open letter on his show. So if you want to find that on YouTube, it'll probably be extremely interesting. The Harry Binswanger letter, his website, Harry Binswanger.
That was the moratorium on brains. I saw some of those posts. I haven't had time to read them yet, so I'll go back and read them. I mean, I was thinking it might be worthwhile to make the case and put it on somewhere like the HBL. So it's like, tear it apart. Like, this is what we think. This is why we're like, people are afraid. Where are we wrong? So I've been thinking about doing that, but I'm moving. I just got a lot going on. But at some point, I might try to sit down and write that myself.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'd like to read that, and I'm going to read Harry's stuff as well. Folks, upcoming 7 p.m. UK time, the Fountainhead Book Club for Ayn Rand Center UK members. The session will also be live streamed to YouTube members. The link is in the chat. Once again, Trent, thank you very much. It was a very interesting chat for me. I learned something, and I hope the people out there in the Ayn Rand Center UK universe did as well. Until that time, folks, remember to always check your premises. Peace.